This video is brought to you by Brilliant. For understandable reasons, Sweden's accession to NATO has been dominating the European headlines recently. But in a way, this has obscured the fact that Sweden isn't in great shape at the moment, especially when it comes to the economy. IMF data from 2023 suggests that, apart from Estonia, Sweden was the worst performing economy in Europe last year, with GDP contracting by 0.7%. And late last month, Sweden's statistical authority announced that Sweden's GDP unexpectedly shrank in the last quarter of 2023, its third consecutive quarterly contraction. This all comes off the back of a slow-burning crisis in Sweden's housing market, which has helped push Swedish bankruptcies to the highest level in 3 decades. Sweden's lagging economy presents a real dilemma for its government, who are coming under increasing pressure to invest in its ailing welfare state, once the envy of the Western world, and a model for social democrats everywhere. While it's important not to overstate the severity of the crisis here, Sweden is still one of the wealthiest countries in the world after all. Sweden's welfare state clearly isn't what it once was, though. Its education system is in tatters, unemployment is on the rise, and a wave of gang violence is engulfing the country. So in this video, we'll take a look at how Sweden's celebrated welfare state has changed over time, the headwinds currently facing the Swedish economy, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a bit of context regarding Sweden's economy. For years, Sweden seemed to have it all. After staying neutral throughout World War II, in the second part of the 20th century, Sweden's economy developed into a large knowledge-intensive and export-oriented manufacturing economy. With a generous welfare state, a world-renowned education system, low crime rates, and impressive levels of gender equality. However, like many other developed countries at the time, in the 1990s, Sweden moved towards a more market-oriented economy, as national finances came under strain and the Social Democrats' electoral dominance waned. Much of the Swedish welfare state, education system, and critical infrastructure was cut or privatised, with government spending falling from 70% of GDP down to less than 50%. In theory, these measures were supposed to improve efficiency and reduce government debt, which was then running at about 70% of GDP. To be fair to the Swedish government, it sort of worked, and Sweden's debt-to-GDP ratio is now down to about 40%, one of the lowest in Europe. Nonetheless, weaker public services do seem to have contributed to Sweden's economic and social issues. Let's start with Sweden's economy. As we mentioned in the intro, the Swedish economy is technically in recession at the moment, having contracted for 3 successive quarters. And even the Swedish government admits that the economic recovery won't begin until 2025. The proximate cause of Sweden's economic downturn is inflation, and its supposed remedy, interest rate hikes. In a bid to get inflation under control, which still remains above the central bank's target, Sweden's central bank carried out an 18-month campaign of rising interest rates. Back in 2020, the Riksbank policy rate held steady at 0%, but has since climbed to 4%. The theory goes that these higher interest rates increase the incentive to save, and make it more expensive, i.e. less attractive, to borrow. But this has really impacted Swedish households via the housing market. This is essentially because, unlike in countries like the UK, most Swedes have so-called floating mortgages rather than fixed-rate mortgages, which means that when interest rates rise, their mortgage costs go up almost automatically. According to data from last year, 40% of mortgages in Sweden have interest rates fixed for 3 months or less, while just 18% have fixes longer than 3 years. Higher mortgage costs mean 2 things. First, a housing slump, because people don't want to buy houses when mortgages are expensive. But second, higher mortgage costs also mean a drop in disposable income for many Swedish households, which has reduced domestic consumption and hurt Sweden's economy. As a result, GDP has contracted and unemployment has risen, reaching 8% at the end of last year. Like many other European countries, another issue facing Sweden's economy is China. Since the 1990s, Sweden has eagerly invited foreign businesses to invest in factories and critical infrastructure, particularly from China. But as European policymakers become more aware of the security risks involved with Chinese investment, and Europe comes under increased pressure from the US to take a more hawkish line on the issue, Sweden has decided to decouple somewhat from China. The Swedish government is now planning to take away some operating contracts of Chinese companies, and in December implemented the EU's FDI regime, a legal framework to allow the country to veto foreign investment if they worry it may compromise national security. Sweden's economic crisis has, in turn, been exacerbated by a host of social issues. As we've detailed in previous videos, in the past few years, Sweden has been rocked by a grim wave of gang violence, pushing its firearm homicide rate to the highest in Europe. The left blames high crime rates on the privatisation of Sweden's welfare state, while the right mostly blames it on immigration, which has skyrocketed recently. Whatever the cause, it's clearly not good for Sweden's economy, and the governor of the Riksbank warned last month that the crime crisis now risks damaging the country's long-term economic growth. Rising crime rates amongst young people have also put strain on Sweden's education system. While there's some evidence that Sweden's education system actually started declining when it was decentralised in the 90s, creating a sort of marketised school system, the crisis has become particularly acute recently, and late last year the education minister declared a system failure in the country's free schools. This presents a difficult dilemma for the Swedish government. The economy isn't in great shape, and further spending on education could mean more inflation. But a well-functioning education system is absolutely fundamental to any developed knowledge-based economy. There's already some tentative evidence that Sweden's human capital is on the decline. Sweden used to have the highest share of the workforce in the EU employed in the brain business sector. But in the past few years, Sweden has fallen behind certain Eastern European countries. So what happens next? Well, like the rest of Europe, Sweden isn't expected to see any rapid economic growth in the next year or so. There might be some quiet respite if the Riksbank decides to hold or even cut interest rates, which looks possible, but it won't be transformative. Perhaps the more interesting question is how Swedish politics reacts to the various crises afflicting the country. At the moment, Sweden has a minority government led by Ulf Kristersson's moderate party, but they're not particularly popular. Kristersson has an approval rating of about -20, and the moderates are currently polling on just 18%, so will probably be voted out at the next election. How Swedes respond to these crises will depend on who wins then, and who the more left-wing Social Democrats or the more right-wing Swedish Democrats can form a governing majority. A lot of stuff that we talk about at TLDR News can seem pretty complicated, especially when we dive into economics and detailed data, which is why we use Brilliant.org to keep us sharp. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Brilliant is a learning platform designed to be uniquely effective. Their first principles approach helps you build understanding from the ground up, which is also how we structure TLDR videos. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that lets you play with concepts, a method proven to be 6 times more effective than just watching lectures. Plus, all content on Brilliant is crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, Google, and more. Brilliant helps build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So, while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. Learning a little every day is one of the most important things you can do, both for your personal and professional growth. Brilliant helps you build real knowledge in minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have time. It's the opposite of mindless scrolling. Brilliant recently launched a ton of new content in data, all of which uses real-world data to train you to see trends and make better informed decisions, something politicians could really learn from. Anyway, these are for learners of any level to start or continue learning data analysis, with a fully built-out suite of new content, from Bayes' theorem to multiple linear regression. And you can truly learn by doing, as you'll be working with real datasets from sources like Starbucks, Twitter, Spotify, and more. To try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, click on the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Brilliant for their support of TLDR News.